Welcome everybody. Welcome to our speaking series. We were going to begin this last week, but turns out that things in Washington are even more hectic than we thought they would be. And inauguration and the week before inauguration have been some intense Wednesdays. So welcome to this. Our first guest is, for this series is David Marchik, who is director of the Center for Presidential Transitions. And he's worn a lot of hats since he left Orinda, where he went to high school. Did you go to, David, what high school was it?
Went to Marimani, and then I went to a school called College Prep in Berkeley.
Okay, so some of you from the north, from Northern California may know that, the Bay Area, but since he left Orinda, he's worn, like I say, many hats. He came to Washington. He, among other things, worked in the Clinton NAFTA war room back in 1993 when NAFTA was a big Democratic priority. He went on to become Deputy U.S. Assistant Secretary of State in the Clinton administration, worked on Open Skies Initiative, among other things. Went off to work after getting master's degrees in, I may not be doing this in the right order, but getting a master's degree in public administration at the University of Texas and a law degree from GW, George Washington University here in Washington. He worked as, he joined the Carlyle Group, which is a Washington-based asset management firm. He was managing director, a lot of impressive titles here. Global head of regulatory affairs. He's a senior counsel at Covington and Burling. And somehow he has free time to teach at the Tuck Business School at Dartmouth. But we have him here and we can talk about any of those things. But the reason we thought it would be great to have him here is, it didn't mention, he graduated, he's a Triton. He's a Triton. He got his undergraduate degree at UCSD, which is his UC connection. But we're a week into the new administration, and he heads the Center for Presidential Transition. So let's start with talking about that. And so briefly explain what this commission is, who pays for it, and why it does what it does.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. I love the University of California. I grew up in Berkeley, and my dad basically said, you can go to any UC school you want, but pick one. It was a lot easier to get in then when I applied. And I grew up in Berkeley. I wanted to be an engineer, and I didn't want to live near home. So I went to San Diego. I took a year of engineering, and then I realized I wasn't very good at that. And I became a history major. And I'm still very active. I'm on the board of the UC San Diego Foundation. I spent a lot of time and have supported UC San Diego philanthropically. And my daughter's on the phone, Hannah, or she's on the Zoom, and she goes to Berkeley. So very proud of her, and tried to get her to go to San Diego, but she wanted to go to Berkeley. So the Center for Presidential Transition is part of something called the Partnership of Public Service, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization focused on effectiveness in government. And our belief is that an effective government starts with an effective transition. And so we're a nonprofit that gets money from foundations and individuals to support good government. And a presidential transition is usually non-controversial. This is perhaps the most unusual presidential transition in the history of the United States. We can talk about that. But our goal is to make transitions more effective.
This is something which is I'm just learning about. So Donald Trump was clearly difficult. I think that's one way to put it with the transition. There are lots of other adjectives you could use. What is it that requires him to do anything with the transition, or could he simply just walk out of the door at 11:59 on Inauguration Day and say, good luck?
So it's a great question. There is a law called the Presidential Transition Act. It was passed in 1963 after a really close election. John F. Kennedy beat Richard Nixon by 112,000 votes nationwide. That was a close election. It was one vote per precinct. If each precinct had a different vote, one vote, Nixon would have won. And Congress after that, so this year, by comparison, there was almost 8 million votes differential. It wasn't a close election. So Congress basically said that was too close to call. And some people advised Nixon to contest the election, and Nixon, being the paragon of virtue, said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to concede because I don't want to put the country through a crisis. So Congress passed a law that basically imposed various obligations on the outgoing administration to collaborate, to cooperate, to brief, and to hand over power in a smooth way, which clearly did not happen this year.
So how do you, there was a controversy when the General Service Administration did not
Ascertain? Yep.
That's the word, ascertain that Biden was the next president. Under what kind of rules? How do you ascertain that?
Okay, so nobody should know the word ascertain except for people that go to UC. The word ascertain is the legal standard in the Presidential Transition Act. It's been pro forma, ministerial, an administrative, easy decision. Typically, the elections are ascertained around 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock on election night. So the law says that the GSA administrator, there's an organization in Washington called the General Service Administration. They're responsible for real estate for the government, which shows how non-controversial it's supposed to be. They're supposed to determine the likely or apparent winner of the presidential election. And once they do, that candidate gets office space, iPhones, money for staff, security clearances, a whole suite of support from the outgoing administration to prepare to govern, because there's only 75 to 78 days in a transition. It's a very short time, and a new president has to appoint 4,000 individuals to take jobs to control the government. And so the GSA administrator this year, under pressure from Trump, clearly did not ascertain that there was a winner in the election, despite the fact that it wasn't close. It was 306 electoral vote differentials, 8 million vote popular vote count. And there were 4 states where Biden was well beyond the margin of victory, which would have had to change in order for Trump to win. And the likelihood of that happening, for those statistical experts on the phone, Hannah's taken statistics at Berkeley this semester, is like 0.001%. So for one state to overturn, it's like a 1% chance. And for 4 states, it's basically 0.1 times 4. So times 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.1.
Okay, so explain then, and so that all leads up to sort of the most obvious question, which is how much did Trump's resistance to the transition hurt the country or hurt the transition, or does it have an effect now that we're a week in to the new administration?
It had a big impact. So on November 13th, which was 10 days after the election, and around 7 days after the winner was declared, Biden was asked the same question that Mark Sanderloh was asked at a press conference. He said, "What's the impact of the delay?" And what Biden said was, "More people will die." So over the 78 days of the transition, 172,000 Americans died of coronavirus. And the most impactful issue that it caused is that the Biden team didn't get access to the experts at the Defense Department and the Health Department who were responsible for distributing the vaccine. It was delayed, and there was not perfect cooperation. And so the most important issue facing the country is the distribution of that vaccine. It's not a policy issue. It's basically how to get 300 million shots in various arms. And they didn't get access.
And so just to try to explain what that real, I mean, because you read that they didn't have access. What does that mean? I don't know how they couldn't make phone calls because those phone calls wouldn't be returned. I mean,
correct. They were not allowed to speak. I had people from the Trump administration calling me saying, "I'm responsible for helping develop the distribution strategy for the vaccine." Do you choose nursing homes first, the elderly, teachers, bus drivers? Who's in line first? And how do we communicate with governors? And they were prohibited from talking to the Biden team for 3 weeks.
Prohibited because of the president's.
Correct. Yep.
So when did you start working with the Biden folks on transition?
So I started working with the Trump White House in case he won. We're nonpartisan. And also with all the Democratic campaigns in January a year ago. And our message then was that if you're still standing in the Democratic primary, you need to start planning the transition in March. By the time March came around, there were 2 candidates left, Biden and Sanders. And we worked with them, and then Sanders dropped out, and we started intensively working with the Biden transition team in mid-March, daily, hourly calls.
The media, which I was a part of, if they ever get word that somebody's working on their transition, it's this cliche of, oh, you're measuring the drapes already. It comes across as this arrogant thing. I mean, at what level were you working? How seriously was the Biden campaign at that point?
Oh, they were very serious. I think that issue of measuring the drapes is behind us because the Presidential Transition Act, and really because of what happened on 9/11. So let's look at 2000. So in the year 2000, there was a delayed election because of Florida. There it was one state, 537 votes that determined who would get to 270 electoral votes. And Bush, because of that, only had a 35-day transition instead of 75 days. 8 months later, 2 planes attacked the country, and Bush didn't have senior national security people in their jobs. And so the 9/11 Commission, which was kind of an audit exercise, very senior, Mark knows about it, found that the delayed transition imperiled US national security. It imperiled our readiness. So the Presidential Transition Act was amended to address this exact issue, to get rid of the stigma that candidates are measuring the drapes. Now the presumption is if you're a responsible candidate, you should plan. And that's exactly what Biden did at the top levels. He was very serious about it. He's the most experienced person ever to become president. George H.W. Bush was probably second. And he was deadly serious about the transition because he knew he had to be ready on January 20th.
So how do countries like the UK, which you read about, has same day transition or maybe 1 day transition? How did they pull that off when 78 days isn't enough here or barely enough here?
So if there are business school students on the phone, if you go to Haas or you want to go to Haas and you were to design a presidential transition, you would never design it as it is in the United States. 4,000 managers leave, and on the same day they're supposed to come in. It's impossible. Imagine at your high school or at Berkeley, if the chancellor, the vice chancellors, the next levels down, and all the best professors left one day, and then new people had to come in. In the UK, there's like a very small number of people that change. The ministers, and typically 1 or 2 aides for each minister. So it's 75, 100 people. Here it's 4,000.
So, I mean, there are a lot of people who think that the 75 days is way too long, that, the voters have spoken, there's a new person in charge, and that maybe the transition should begin earlier. But in any event, inaugurations, which used to be in March, and I guess in the 30s were moved up to January, ought to be moved even closer. Maybe by December, they could go ahead and inaugurate somebody. Does that make any sense to you?
I think there's pros and cons. Clearly, 4 months was too long. It was changed in 1933. In 1933, during the 4-month interregnum, another great word you learn about transitions along with
interregnum.
Interregnum, the time between the election and the inauguration.
Okay.
That was the Great Depression. So unemployment peaked. We had bank runs in 25 states. Hitler came to power, and Hoover fiddled. He didn't cooperate with Roosevelt at all. So there was a constitutional amendment that shortened the transition period to from the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, which is the date of the election, to January 20th at noon. That's 75 days, 78 days, that's a short time. Typically, the outgoing and the incoming cooperate. In 234 years of transitions since George Washington handed the keys to John Adams, we've never had this happen. It's the first time in the history of the United States. So, is it the laws? Is it the Constitution, or is it the unusual nature of this individual president? I don't know.
So I don't know how much, you may not have the clearance, but maybe you do to know some of these things. But I mean, what happens? You would think that, say, between 11 a.m., an hour before there's a new president, and 2 o'clock in the afternoon on inauguration day would be a very interesting time with a new or an outgoing commander in chief for the United States for somebody to attack the United States, for there to be somebody to pressure us to do things that a commander in chief needs to be there for. How does the Pentagon or whoever it is?
They're on high alert. It's a great question, and I'll tell you a story from the Bush to Obama transition, which was probably the smoothest transition of power in modern history. Bush did a great job because he was scarred by 9/11. He basically said, I don't want the next person to have happen to him what happened to me. So that day, in a normal transition, the president is hosting the president-elect and many members of the team. And they were in the Oval Office so it was Bush and Obama and some of their top national security people. So the outgoing National Security Advisor, outgoing Secretary of State, incoming National Security Advisor. And someone came up from the Situation Room, tapped the president on the shoulder and said, excuse me, Mr. President, but I need you, and you, pointing to the outgoing and incoming National Security Advisor, outgoing and incoming Secretary of State. The intelligence agencies got information that there was a terrorist attack planned on the inauguration by some Somali nationalists. So the outgoing and the incoming went down to the Situation Room and basically decided what to do.
Wow.
What does Obama do when he's on stage if there's a bomb at the inauguration? Does he leave the stage? Does he stay on stage? Does he make an announcement? What's the image of the United States if the president of the United States, while taking the oath of office, runs and ducks and covers? And they basically developed a whole plan. Luckily, that didn't happen, but transitions are a time of great vulnerability. And going back in history for many, many cycles, it's a time when our adversaries have sought to take advantage of the United States. It happened during the Carter-Reagan transition. It's happened many times. Remember, the Iran hostage crisis broke the day of inauguration of Ronald Reagan.
Or it ended, right?
Ended,
they freed the hostages, yeah.
And the Soviet Union cracked down on Polish dissidents on that day because they figured America's looking inward and they're not going to focus on us.
All right, let me move on again. So anybody, there'll be a chance to ask questions very soon. So think of good questions. Let me ask you an awkward question. You don't mind that. I've asked you, in the press, I used to ask you awkward questions before, I'm sure. You grew up in Orinda, you grew up in Berkeley, you went to UC.
My daughter thinks I'm awkward most of the time, so this will be
yes,
good.
But that's a different kind of awkward.
Okay.
You've worked in Democratic administrations. You worked at the Carlyle Group, which had a reputation for being, partly vilified by people like Michael Moore for being, sort of capitalizing on American defense and being somehow mysteriously behind things. I'm not even asking you to defend the Carlyle Group so much but you were doing things. How do you work for a big organization when they're being pilloried by people who you might even agree with some of these people on some issues?
So, I loved my time at Carlyle. It's a great organization. What happened was that the Carlyle Group had a bunch of former politicians affiliated with it, including former President Bush, Frank Carlucci, who was the Secretary of Defense. And on 9/11, they had a conference in Washington, and one of the bin Ladens was at this conference. The bin Laden family was a famous Saudi family, construction company, and they obviously had a bad son. And so the fact that this happened with these former politicians while Bush was president created this maelstrom of disinformation. And there was this narrative. And it was an investment company. So what happened is that David Rubenstein, who was the head of the Carlyle Group, basically went to, and he's written about this in his book and he's talked about this, so I'm not spilling any secrets, went to these former politicians and said, we need to separate because the perception and the narrative about our firm is too negative. And so thank you for your service, but we no longer need your service. And one of the things that I did was help clarify Carlyle's reputation. So this reputation that it was a defense organization, less than 0.5% of its investments are in the defense space. Carlyle owns, or used to own, Dunkin' Donuts. They own Beats headphones. They own Hertz Rent-A-Car. So anyway, I loved the organization, and sometimes organizations get bad raps, and we fixed it. And now I think it's a very, very well-respected organization without that baggage. So did I answer your question unawkwardly?
Yeah, I mean, certainly unawkwardly. And it's something that obviously a lot of people face. And in Washington and in jobs across the country. I mean, I work for the University of California. They do some things which I would regard as hideous. I don't feel guilty when they do that because I'm nowhere near the decisions on those. But I know that Carlyle, thanks to Michael Moore in big part, had this scarlet letter on them among a lot of the left. And it may have been
sometimes the press creates narratives which are not true. So
really, yes, that is. I teach this in my media class, and I agree with you there. So let me just ask you before I turn over to students. So you said you want to be an engineer, figured out that was not going to be your path. So when you were a senior, like a lot of our students are down in San Diego, you couldn't. Well, maybe you did, but you couldn't have imagined that you'd be working, as a deputy assistant secretary of state, or that you would be, talking about presidential transitions on public television stations, let alone in a forum like this. I mean, tell us how that evolved.
So this is a great question. And this is something I love to talk to students about in my class. And also I had the privilege of speaking at the UC San Diego convocation, not last year, but the year before. That's, when I think it was 9,000.
Normal, yeah.
9,000 freshmen, mostly falling asleep during my speech, but a few of them listened. But my basic message was that many careers are totally accidental, that I didn't plan any of it. When I went to college, I thought I was going to be an engineer, and I wasn't very good at that, so I became a history major. Then I went to law school, and I got involved with the Clinton campaign. And if you ask me, I took a leave of absence. If you ask my mom, I dropped out. And I got a job in the White House. And then I worked at a law firm, and then I went to a financial services organization. So to me, I couldn't plan my career. And if I tried to, I would have failed. And so I think that a lot of people think that their careers are going to be linear and you need to plan out everything perfectly. And my message is you can't do that. And what you need to do is figure out that Venn diagram overlap of the skill sets that you like, of the things you like doing and the things you're good at. And as long as you're in that overlapping space, you're going to be successful. If you do something that you don't like doing, you're not going to be successful because you won't have your heart and soul into it. And if you do something you like, but you're not good at, I mean, I like basketball, but there aren't a lot of, 6'1" Jewish asthmatic great basketball players. So
They probably were in the 40s, actually.
maybe in the 40s, but
yeah.
So,
Okay.
just follow your passion and take risks.
How did you, I mean, so when you came to Washington, which is the first time I spoke to you, because as we recalled, I had come out there to write for the San Francisco Chronicle.
I remember.
And so I was writing about NAFTA, and you were one of the people I could call to talk to at the Clinton White House. You were a law school dropout at that point. I was. So how did you afford that? They couldn't have been paying you very much money.
So I think I made something like, $28,000 a year. And
back then is better than 28,000 now. It still does not make you
still not very much. I lived in a basement apartment for $400 a month.
Yep.
And I ate ramen, and I mean, I didn't have any money. And I worked in the White House, and then I said I should probably get my law degree. So I went back to night school while I was working in the White House, which was pretty brutal. And I mean, I remember I was a deputy secretary at the State Department, pretty senior. And I married someone who had a better job than me, and she helped me pay off my student loans. So
that was an option while you're young.
That wasn't an option. So, yeah. But I still remember writing the last check for my student loans, and what a liberating feeling it was.
All right, so we've got a question, and so feel free, if you have a question, to type it into the Q&A. If you put your name down, we will have you. We'll because of this silly webinar format, it's the only way we can pull this off. So we'll unmute you, and you can ask it, but anonymously. So somebody asks, somebody says, "Thank you for talking to us. What does your support for a new president look like? Do you negotiate the conversations between the staffs? Do you assist in allocating funds? How in the weeds is your role?"
Oh, that's a great question. So we played a big role this year in being intermediaries between the Trump White House and the Biden team, because in normal administrations, they talk. So when Bush handed off to Obama, and even when Obama handed off to either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, the outgoing and the incoming actually spoke all the time. And the Bush White House established this precedent to talk directly to the candidates. So in 2008, Bush was very unpopular. The Iraq War was waging, and he had like 30% popularity. And basically both Obama and John McCain, who was running against Obama, ran against Bush. They both ran against an unpopular president. But Bush did the right thing and said, I want to set up the next president to be successful. And he had his staff work directly with the campaigns. This year, that didn't happen. And so we were kind of in the middle. I would talk to the Biden people, and I would talk to the Trump people, and have messages back and forth, because they weren't allowed to talk.
Did you ever speak to Biden or Trump, for that matter?
I never spoke to Biden or Trump, but I dealt with the people right below him, chief of staff level and the top people for Biden.
Okay, we have a much more practical question here. How big is your staff, and do you have interns?
That's a great question. We have about 30 people on full-time staff, and we have some wonderful interns. The interns get great experience. They helped with podcasts. They help write articles. They get to author articles on our blog and on our website. So if you go to the Partnership for Public Service, there's an internship application. It's a wonderful, wonderful internship. And if you can apply to the Center for Presidential Transition. And you can also send Mark your resume, and I can help you, and he can get in touch with me.
I will pass it along. Or your program administrators, you guys all know out there. Those of you who are coming here, because we might have some students who are coming for the spring quarter out here. So is this, I know that, is this down, not off time, but is it downtime for the transition? I mean, you've got 4 more years till another transition now.
So I'm going to leave soon. It's a temporary job.
Uh-huh.
The center kind of, skinnies its staff a little, does does kind of a lot of work looking back, interviewing people in the Biden team, figuring out what went well, what didn't go well, and what can they recommend to do better for the next cycle. And in 3 years, they'll then ramp back up to get ready for the 2024 cycle, when they will be working with the Biden administration, who will be running for re-election, presumably, and whoever the Republican candidate is.
Okay, so you had mentioned, and then somebody wants to follow up on this, that you had started working with the Trump administration in case they had won. What happens when a president wins a second term? Why is there a transition?
So there is it's a transition to a second term because there's huge change. So if you think about the data, I mentioned there are 4,000 political positions. And we did an analysis of the last 5 presidents in year 5 of how many cabinet officers, deputy secretaries, and undersecretaries. So the top 3 layers of government. And basically, if you take the time between the president takes his second oath of office, or her, and 6 months, so 6 months after the second inauguration, almost half of those people leave, either voluntarily or involuntarily. And so our advice is that a president needs to start planning in year 4 for year 5, because you're going to have huge turnover. And there's a debate. I do a podcast called Transition Lab, and I had one podcast with 2 former White House chiefs of staff, second-term chiefs of staff, Josh Bolten, who was the chief of staff for Bush, and Dennis McDonough, who was the chief of staff for Obama, who's now the nominee for the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And they were good friends, and they're both good friends of mine. And we had this debate, and Dennis said, well, we had a better administration because we had less turnover in the second term. And Josh said, well, we had a better administration because we had more turnover, because people are tired and you need fresh eyes, fresh legs, fresh ideas for the second term. So there's a lot of turnover, and that's what we advise.
So somebody asks how much easier it is if the outgoing or incoming administration are the same, are from the same party.
That is a great question. It's not frequent. In the last, well, you think about the last 100 years, basically you had Roosevelt to Truman, and you had Reagan to Bush.
Right.
The Reagan to Bush transition was very, very difficult, because all of the Reagan people said, oh, Bush was the vice president. It's a continuation of Reagan. It's basically the Reagan third term. I'll stay. And Bush came in and said, I want my own people. So it was a very difficult transition, because when there's a change in party, everybody expects to leave. But here, everybody expects to stay, and they had to ease people out, sometimes gracefully and sometimes not.
Okay. Again, a more nuts and bolt question. How important was your major to your job choices? Was substance important, or were the skills you learned more important in college to the choices and your successes?
So I may never be invited back to a UC presentation based on my advice. I don't think your major matters. I don't know, Mark, if you agree.
Yeah, are you kidding? You think I'm my pedigree is journalism. I couldn't agree more with that. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think what matters is the skill sets you learn. Being a good communicator, being a good writer, speaker, being a good problem solver, and being a good leader. So actually, the most important thing that I did at UCSD was not study. I was involved in student government. I was the student body president at UC San Diego. And I ran against probably the most popular guy at UC San Diego. He was the head of the fraternity council. He was much cooler than I was, although my daughter thinks I'm cool. And I had to basically demonstrate that I could do a better job. It wasn't a popularity contest. And so that was hard. I mean, I had to put myself out there and try to win votes and try to convince people. And then the skills I learned of doing that, like, were critical for me to going to grad school and for learning how to be a leader. And so I don't think it matters whether you're a bio major, sociology major, psychology major. It's, how do you use that major to find something you like? How do you use that major to learn how to be good at it and to be a good problem solver, communicator, and to excel in whatever the it is that you do? You agree
Okay,
with
so
that?
yeah, I certainly agree with this. But again, I don't come up through the academic ranks, so I always wonder if my door room's open in my classes, if other academics were to hear this, if they would agree too. But
I think if you want to go to med school, well, my dad was a doctor and he was a history major. So he took all the sciences. I just think being really good at whatever the it is that you do is more important than what the it is.
so how did you get to, as you point out, so you've done this for this cycle,
Yeah.
for this transition, and there'll be
Yeah.
somebody new for the next one.
Yeah.
You certainly, you sound, I'm sure you are extraordinarily well versed on transitions. How do you get that from, being at the Carlisle Group, being at the State Department, being at the at law firms? I mean, how did you teach yourself this?
So this is why your major is not important. I didn't know anything about transitions. In most of the jobs I've done, I'm totally unqualified. I didn't know anything about finance when I went to Carlisle. When I was negotiating transportation agreements internationally, I didn't know anything about it. I've worked hard. I learned. I found people that knew more than me. And I studied. So for this job, over the last year, I've probably read 25 to 30 books. I talked to everybody I could. I read everything I could on transitions, and I enjoy it. I mean, I love reading about this. I like history. I like politics. I like change. And so I just learned it and I made it up as I go along. I'll tell you a great story from when I first met Mark. So I was 27 or 28 and I worked on the Clinton campaign, and I happened to be working in the White House on the second Sunday after Clinton took office. And I was there on a Sunday. I always work hard. And someone said, "Hey, I'm going to go have coffee with President Clinton. You want to come with me?" I'm like, yeah, of course. So there were 3 or 4 of us in the Oval Office having coffee, and I'm just a kid. And I didn't really know what to say. And so that Tuesday night, this was 10 days after he's in office, he was giving his first Oval Office address on the economy. We were in a recession. And I said, "Mr. President, are you nervous?" This is probably a stupid thing to ask a president, but I didn't know any better. "Are you nervous about your speech on Tuesday?" And he said, "Shit, yes, I'm making this up as I go along." And I remember that forever, which is that if a president of the United States says, "I'm making this up as I go along," then pretty much everybody else is. So the thing is, like, how did you learn to be a journalist? You made it up as you went along. You learned it. You had to do NAFTA one day and healthcare the next day and the economy the next day. And you were intellectually curious. You took risks. You called 30 people and maybe 10 of them returned your calls. And you just figured it out. And those are the skill sets that I learned at UC at San Diego. And that's why I'm grateful for the UCs.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, just to reiterate, put an exclamation point, I love that part of being a journalist, was like the reading of the books and all. And I tell this to my students who have to write papers, become an instant expert in something. That's different than an academic who would become a more narrow but real expert of somebody. There are academics who have done nothing but presidential transitions their whole lives, who have probably been doing this since their mid-20s.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't sort of piggyback off their work. And I love just getting up to speed on this stuff. And if you don't enjoy it, you're not going to be good at that. Somebody asks, and it's sort of related, but I hear many lawyers recommend to young undergraduates not to go to law school. What do you think about that? Was law school a good decision for you?
So I didn't really know what I was going to do, to be honest with you. And so what do you do when you don't know what you're going to do? You go to law school. I didn't love law school. I was not a great student, but I'm really happy I have the degree. It's a great degree to have. You learn problem solving. You learn how to think on the spot because you're called on in class. You learn how to be a good writer, to write advocacy in an advocacy style. It enhances your earning potential, and it's a very, very flexible degree. So I think that if I got a master's in public affairs, and I didn't think that that was, that useful a degree. I think it's good to have a terminal degree in whatever it is, to do the top of whatever it is. So have a law degree, a business degree, a medical degree, be an MD or be a PhD. So I think that one of those is a very good graduate degree.
I want to add, I have a brother and sister in town, both of whom went to law school. Both of them worked as lawyers. Neither of them practice law now, but neither of them could be doing these great jobs that they have had they not gone to law school.
Right.
I was the sort of the black sheep, the odd duck, whatever the bad slang is. So you've seen all these positions in Washington. If you could be if your next post was anything in Washington,
I like to work at the UCDC Center.
Well, that's going to be that's a hard one to get, but easier than others. But yeah, I mean, seriously, what area would you? I mean, if you had to work in a cabinet agency, would you want to do that? Would you like to be in the Senate, in the House? Would you?
So I'd like to do something where I could run something and have an impact. At this stage of my life, I've been lucky and I have some financial flexibility, and I want to give back, basically. So I'm spending a lot of time on philanthropy. I'm volunteering for this role. I'm not getting paid. And I just want to serve.
Could you explain that? So you're not getting paid because you have built up enough resources that you can afford to do that?
Yes, I got lucky to work at a firm that went public, and
Okay, yeah,
that's
a
retired.
very nice luxury and a rare luxury to have.
It's a rare luxury.
It's almost as rare as being asked to have coffee with the president of the United States. I mean, that's amazing.
So I want to do things which are service oriented and helping people, helping less privileged, helping protect our natural resources. So that's what I want to do. I don't know what the it is, but I basically am 54. I've had a lot of luck, and I want to dedicate my life to the rest of my life to doing things that are interesting, where I learn and where I can give back.
Okay, that we're out of questions at the moment, so I'm going to ask a question. So again, you're going to have to listen to my questions if you guys don't ask some. And David's not going to like my questions as much as your questions, actually, because here's a good awkward question. That's what the media, that's what you're trained to do. You worked to make sure that NAFTA was approved in 1993. And there's been a lot of controversy about NAFTA. Knowing what you know about NAFTA now, do you still think it was a good deal? And would you still work for it? Or do you think it came out differently than you had anticipated?
So I think that 2020 is perfect. You have perfect vision. I think that when we passed NAFTA, it was a good deal at that moment. It was a very different time. The United States had historically a very, very tough relationship with Mexico. Lots of problems, lots of tensions. And I think NAFTA brought us closer. And I think it ushered in an era of greater liberalization of trade. Our tariffs were already low. So if a product came from Mexico to the United States, the tariff rate was an average of 4%. If a product went from the United States to Mexico, the average tariff was in the 25 to 30% range. I think what we've learned over the last, 28 years, is that there are parts of society who are negatively affected by open competition. And I think that trade agreements in the future need to do much more to protect that part of the American society than we knew 28 years ago. If you think about it, technology is probably the greatest job creator and job destroyer of any other factor. So, for example, my iPhone has replaced computers. It's replaced maps. It's replaced cameras. And so it's replaced banks. It's replaced fax machines. And so if you were in any of those industries, if you work for Kodak, this has been a terrible thing for you. And so I do think that trade agreements tend to help the country overall, but have a negative impact on lower skilled Americans, and the country needs to figure out a way to address that.
And politically, and just to push on that, I mean, just tonight I heard Gina McCarthy, is that her name, the new climate policy?
Yep.
And they kept pushing on public TV today to talk about the climate change, how it's going to hurt people's jobs. And she kept saying, but it's going to create all these great new jobs. But what she couldn't say, because she knew she'd get killed for saying it, is, yes, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. But there'll be more winners than there will be losers. But it's not like the coal mine worker in West Virginia is necessarily going to be the one who's employed at the solar plant. But Hillary Clinton got destroyed when she said that. And she said, these jobs aren't coming back. And she went on to say, but we're going to have bigger and better things. But these jobs aren't coming back. Politically, and this is, I guess, then leads to a broader question. You've been in Washington long enough now that there is so much outside cynicism about Washington. Where do you feel right now in terms of optimism and cynicism about having the system work, having politics and media, sort of be not how much is people wanting to do good able to overcome that? And how optimistic are you the next generation will be able to do that?
So I think the last 4 years have been one of the most challenging times in our country. Our institutions were bent. I don't think they were broken. I think that unsavory attitudes that have always existed in the United States were allowed to be unleashed in the last 4 years. You saw evidence of that in Charlottesville. You saw evidence of it on January 6th, or evidence of it when armed Americans went into the state capitol in Michigan to protest masks. I'm actually very optimistic about what President Biden's doing. I think his tone has been pitch perfect. I think that he has he's talking about issues that have never been talked about in this way in the United States, about racial justice, about environmental justice, about, if you look at the vaccine and the inequality in terms of access to the vaccine. So, if you think about it, right now, 75-year-olds are eligible for the vaccine. Those are the people that are least able to figure out how to sign on through the internet. And if you are an elderly person that is in a very, very poor community, you may not have good Wi-Fi, you may not have a computer, and it's just going to be that much harder to get a vaccine. And so I think it's wonderful that President Biden is talking about these institutionalized inequities in the country and trying to do something about it. So I'm actually optimistic. I think his tone has been pitch perfect, and I'm excited to see what he does for the country.
All right, so we're getting close to end of time, but if there are any more questions, somebody does ask, you said experience skills are more important versus a college major. How would you rank networking in factors to succeed? And let me just tack on to that. Some people come to Washington with connections. Most people come to Washington. I mean, most of the people on this call don't have those connections. Can you create those connections on your own?
So yes, you can, and networking is really important. When I came to Washington, I knew nobody, and I just started cold calling people. And I kept this kind of spreadsheet of who I called. And again, like when you were a reporter, Mark, if I called 10 people, I might get 3 people to call back, and 1.5 might be nice to me. And it's incredibly frustrating to have a 70% failure rate. But every single one of those people that was nice to me, I basically tried to learn something from them. And then I asked them if they could give me a name or two of someone else. And you just build a network.
So what is because the actual logistics of that, I was telling the story in class today about a time I was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and I finally found an empty bar in a room all by itself, and I was thrilled. I ran up to the bar, and in walked Walter Cronkite, the most famous journalist of the generation. And I said nothing. I had no idea what to say. I said, I wasn't going to say, oh, I respect your work, sir. I froze. And I mean, that happens. Sometimes that happens. And I regret it. I don't know what I would have said to him, but you've been in senior positions. If you had an intern or somebody who, what would be a reasonable thing for an intern to ask you? You've had interns at your job now who just wanted to sort of connect with you and find out. What do you want them to say to you?
Okay, that's a great question. I'll give you another perfect example. So I had a young person just out of college work for me on this project. And I remember I was on the phone with the former chief of staff of the White House and this young fellow. It was his first job out of college. And the White House chief of staff asked him something. And the guy that worked for me kind of stumbled and didn't really know what to say. And so I called him after and I said, all right, let's focus on this moment. You have an opportunity where you have a very senior person who's asking you a question. That's a great opportunity. So what I would suggest you do is next time you have that opportunity, do some research about that person, figure out 1 or 2 questions or 3 questions you'd like to ask that person in advance. What would you like to learn from them? And be prepared. And this young man was whip smart. He was a much better student than I ever was, better writer, and he was just shy and didn't know what to do. Over the year that I worked with him, he started asking questions, he engaged, and he took advantage of every opportunity. So you got to take risks. And most people, if there's a young person that wants to take the time to ask some questions and get to know you, they'll take the time. They enjoy it. So just do your research, ask. Some people are going to be nice, some people are not. Failure is okay. And when you were a reporter, what percentage of the calls that you made were returned to you?
Yep. Not a lot of them, only people who wanted to use. Yeah. I had certainly plenty of people who called back and I talked to who were very mean to me. You have to just deal with that. And other people are absolutely wonderful. Right. People like to talk about themselves. People like to talk about
themselves. So I'll give you another example of something I learned from my former boss, David Rubenstein. When he interviewed people, he judged people not by the answers to the questions that he asked them. Everybody can be ready. Hey, what are your strengths and weaknesses? What do you want to be in 5 years? All those standard questions, you can have a canned answer to that. He judged people by the quality of questions they asked him. Because he said, look, I'm a CEO, I'm a billionaire, I'm a prominent person. But I know when I was 22, if I got to meet me, I would have had 30 questions prepared to learn and to take advantage of that opportunity to talk to this prominent person. And if people don't prepare in that same way and don't have the same questions, that says something about them. So
That's great advice. In fact, we are having a workshop Monday night, and people get invited, the incoming students, on interview skills. And I think that is a huge piece of advice. Almost every interview will have that question. Do you have any questions for us? That you can be prepared for, and that's great advice. Have good questions. Don't say no, I don't think so. You answered them all. Don't say
right,
that.
right.
All
People,
right, David, the hour is up. This is fantastic. We can't get you a job necessarily at UCDC, but I'm going to get you a coffee mug that says UCDC so you can promote it. Make sure your daughter pushes it at Berkeley, so that Hannah, so that lots of your friends come out here. And yeah, this is great, and we will be in touch and look forward to your next. I know you're going back to practice law, but your next carnation in this public world like this, I look forward to.
thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, bye, everybody.